It all started with a phone call I'd been expecting, in some form or another, for most of my adult life. It was from a man named Mr. Fitzwilliam, a lawyer whose voice was as dry and brittle as old parchment. He was my parents' lawyer, a relic from a time when they still engaged with the mundane realities of the world, like wills and testaments, before they ascended into the pastel-hued ether of the Equinox Collective. He informed me, with a practiced and utterly unconvincing tone of condolence, that Robert and Marion, my father and mother, had passed away. There had been an accident. A small private plane, a charter they'd taken to attend a consciousness-raising symposium in Arizona, had gone down in the mountains. There were no survivors. I thanked him, my voice a stranger in my own throat. I felt a hollow space open up in my chest, but it wasn't the clean, sharp void of grief. It was something older, a space that had been carved out years ago, and this news was simply the wind blowing through it. Estrangement is a funny thing. It's a death you mourn while the person is still alive, so when the actual physical death comes, you're left with a confusing echo, a sense of a story ending that you stopped reading halfway through. Mr. Fitzwilliam cleared his throat, pulling me from my thoughts. He said we needed to meet to discuss the estate. The word felt ridiculous. Estate. It implied something grand, something accumulated. My parents hadn't accumulated things. They had shed them. They had shed their old friends, their responsibilities, their entire past. They had shed me. But there was a house, the one I grew up in, and a not insignificant investment portfolio my grandfather had set up. A portfolio they were apparently contractually forbidden from touching, only living off the interest. This, I supposed, was the estate. A week later, I was sitting in Mr. Fitzwilliam's stuffy office. It smelled of leather and dust, and quiet disappointment. He slid a thick vellum document across the polished mahogany desk, the last will and testament of Robert and Marion Croft. My hands were steady as I reached for it. Mapersta, I reached for it. My job is in historical document verification. I spend my days authenticating centuries-old manuscripts, spotting clever forgeries, feeling the subtle tells of counterfeit paper and ink. A modern legal document held no mystique for me, and that's when the floor fell out from under my world. The language was precise, cold, and utterly unambiguous. After a few token bequests of sentimental items to distant cousins, items they had long since abandoned anyway, the will came to the core of the matter. All assets, real property, stocks, bonds, and liquid cash, the entirety of what was supposed to be my inheritance, was to be bequeathed, in its totality, to a non-profit organization, the Equinox Collective. I looked up from the page, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the lawyer, expecting, what? A flicker of sympathy, a shared sense of outrage? I saw nothing but professional neutrality. He said, "It's all perfectly in order, Iris." I witnessed the signing myself. They were of sound mind and body. It's airtight, airtight. The word hung in the air, a perfect sterile prison. My parents, in their final act on this earth, had written me out of existence. They had taken the sum total of their lives, of my grandparents' legacy, and handed it over to him, to Eli, the charismatic, silver-tongued guru who had lured them away from everything. He was the leader of the Equinox Collective, a man with a beatific smile, eyes that seemed to see right into your soul, and a talent for monetizing existential angst. I had seen him in brochures, his white linen clothes billowing in a gentle breeze, his arms outstretched as if to embrace the very sky. He was the man who had convinced my parents that enlightenment could be found in biodynamic farming, aura cleansings, and most importantly, sizable donations. I walked out of that office in a daze. The city streets felt alien, the sounds of traffic and people muted and distant. It wasn't about the money. I had to keep telling myself that, a mantra against the screaming injustice. I have my own life, my own career. I had built a world for myself, entirely separate from them, a fortress of solitude and self-sufficiency. But this wasn't about need. This was about the message. This was their final definitive statement. I was not their legacy. a cult was. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it was what stole my breath. It was a posthumous slap in the face, a final, perfect act of abandonment. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the lawyer's words echoing in my head. Airtight, sound mind and body. The phrases were a legal wall I couldn't scale, but my mind, trained to see the cracks in any story, couldn't let it go. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. At that moment, it was about understanding. It was about needing to know how this final bizarre chapter of my parents' lives had been written. My professional instincts kicked in, a familiar comfort in the sea of emotional chaos. Verification, that was my world. I couldn't verify my parents' love, but I could, perhaps, verify the foundation of the man who had stolen it. Fueled by a cold, quiet rage I hadn't felt in years, I got up, went to my computer, and began to dig. I started with Equinox Collective itself. It was registered as a religious non-profit. Its mission statement, a word salad of spiritual jargon about harmonizing personal energy with terrestrial ley lines. It was all nonsense, but legally sound nonsense. Then I looked at their property. The Peaceful Retreat, as the website called it, was a sprawling 100-acre property of rolling hills and ancient woods about 2 hours north of the city. My parents had sold my childhood home and moved there 5 years ago. I pulled up the property records, my fingers flying across the keyboard, and that's when I found the first thread. It was a small thing, a discrepancy in the deed history, a name. The land was purchased by the collective in 1978, but the seller listed on that deed wasn't a family or a corporation. It was a single individual. The purchase price was laughably low, a fraction of what the land must have been worth even then. It felt wrong. It felt like a story with a missing page, and my job, my entire life, was about finding those missing pages. That single odd detail was the hook. And as I stared at the digital record on my screen, a new feeling began to bloom in the hollow space in my chest, a feeling that was hot and sharp and tasted like iron. It was resolve. The next few weeks were a blur of caffeine and obsession. I took a leave of absence from work, telling my boss I needed to handle family matters, which wasn't even a lie. My apartment, normally a sanctuary of minimalist order, transformed into a war room. The dining table was buried under printouts of county assessor maps, historical land grants, and photocopied legal documents. My professional life had been about verifying the authenticity of the past, and now I was using those same skills to excavate my own. I wasn't just grieving my parents anymore. I was investigating them. My mind kept drifting back, pulling me into memories I had carefully packed away. I remembered being a child, maybe 7 or 8, and my parents had just discovered macrobiotics. Our pantry, once filled with the normal staples of a suburban family, was suddenly a foreign country of brown rice, adzuki beans, and something called gamasio. My mother, Marion, would hand me a bowl of tasteless mush for breakfast, her eyes shining with the fervor of a new convert. "This is cleansing your spirit, Iris," she'd say. I remember the gnawing hunger, the way I'd trade my spiritually pure lunch for a friend's peanut butter sandwich at school. It was the first of many fads. There was the primal scream therapy phase, where I'd huddle in my room, listening to my parents howling their frustrations into pillows in the living room. There was the brief but intense flirtation with a group that believed they could communicate with dolphins telepathically. My father, Robert, a man who had once been a pragmatic engineer, would spend hours staring at the ocean, a hopeful, desperate look on his face. They weren't bad people, not in the conventional sense. They were just lost. They were chasing a feeling of significance that always seemed to be just over the horizon. In the next book, the next workshop, the next charismatic teacher, I was the anchor they were constantly trying to slip. My needs, my school plays, my scraped knees, they were all part of the mundane world they were so desperate to transcend. The golden child in my family wasn't a person, It was a concept, it was enlightenment. And I, with my earthbound reality, could never compete. Their estrangement from me wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow, steady erosion, like a riverbank giving way to the current. The final stage of that erosion was Eli. I found a picture from that time, tucked away in an old album. It was from their first visit to the Equinox Collective. My parents stood on either side of Eli, their faces tilted up towards him, their smiles beatific and utterly vacant. Eli stood between them, a hand on each of their shoulders, his own smile a masterpiece of serene possession. He looked like a benevolent shepherd, and they were his prize sheep. Seeing it again sent a fresh wave of that cold, hard fury through me. He hadn't just taken their money, he had taken their minds, he had consumed them whole. My breakdown, when it came, wasn't loud or dramatic. I was sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by a fortress of paper. At 3 a.m, I was looking at a satellite image of the collective's property on my laptop. The main road, the neatly arranged yurts, the large central meditation hall, and then I saw it. A small, unassuming cottage, almost hidden by a thick grove of pine trees, just outside the official property line. It shared a driveway with the retreat, but was clearly on a separate parcel of land. Curiosity, the driving force of my profession, took over. I pulled up the records for that specific parcel. The owner's name was listed as Alara Vance. The name meant nothing to me, but when I cross-referenced it, a jolt went through me. I ran a search for Eli's full name, Elias Vance. It was his name, but he had dropped the last name years ago, rebranding himself as simply Eli, a mononym that suggested a singular, almost divine importance, Elias Vance. Elara Vance. My blood ran cold. This was the catalyst. This was the moment the vague sense of injustice solidified into a sharp, pointed weapon. I wasn't just looking at a financial transaction anymore. I was looking at a family drama, a history hidden in plain sight. I started digging into the 1970s, the decade the collective had purchased the land. I spent days scrolling through microfilmed records from the county clerk's office, my eyes burning from the strain. I was looking for a ghost, and then I found her. In a dusty, long-forgotten file, I found the original deed for the 100-acre parcel. It was granted in 1972 to two people, Elias Vance and Alara Vance, joint tenants, husband and wife. My heart was pounding. I kept scrolling. Then in 1978, another document, a quitclaim deed. It's a document used to transfer interest in a property, often between family members. This one transferred Alara Vance's entire 50% ownership to Elias Vance for the sum of $1. Her signature was on it, a shaky, uncertain scrawl. The very next day, a new deed was filed. Elias Vance, now the sole owner, sold the entire 100 acres to the newly formed Equinox Collective, a non-profit of which he was the founder, president, and chairman of the board, for $10,000. He had essentially sold the land to himself, using his wife's half to do it. My hands were shaking. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I've seen enough forged 17th-century signatures to know when something is wrong. Alara's signature on that quitclaim deed was too neat in some places, too forced in others. It didn't match her signature on the original joint deed. It felt practiced. It felt false. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling I usually got when closing in on a historical forgery. This was it. This was the crack in the Airtight will. The entire foundation of the Equinox Collective, the holy ground my parents had worshipped, was built on a lie, a cheap, cruel, domestic lie. The rightful owner of at least half, if not all, of that land was not a guru. It was a reclusive old woman living in a cottage next door, the woman he had cheated, his first wife. And at that moment, the quest for understanding transformed into a plan for demolition. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, a phrase that was starting to feel thinner and more transparent every time I used it. It was about correcting the record. It was about historical accuracy. But deep down, I knew. Oh, I knew. It was about tearing down his house of cards with the one thing he couldn't manipulate or spiritually bypass: the cold, hard, verifiable truth. The game had changed. I wasn't the grieving daughter anymore. I was the archivist. And I had just found the original manuscript. My first step was to find a new lawyer. Mr. Fitzwilliam was compromised, a relic of my parents' old life too steeped in the official story. I needed someone sharp, hungry, and unburdened by the past. I found her through a friend of a friend. Her name was Jenna, and she was everything Fitzwilliam wasn't: young, energetic, with an office in a converted warehouse that smelled of fresh coffee and ambition. She listened to my story without interruption, her eyes sharp and focused as I laid out the photocopied deeds, the property maps, and the signature comparisons on her minimalist concrete desk. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "This is beautiful," she said, the word hanging in the air. "Most inheritance disputes are messy, emotional tugs of war. This is a surgical strike. You're not contesting their will. You're contesting the very existence of their primary asset." She looked at the shaky signature on the quitclaim deed. "The statute of limitations on fraud can be tricky," she warned. "It's been decades. But if we can prove she never knew about the transfer, that the signature was a forgery, we might be able to argue that the clock never started ticking. It's a long shot, Iris. A very long shot." "I know," I said, my voice steady, "but it's the only shot I have." Jenna's enthusiasm was a balm to my frayed nerves. She saw the case for what it was: a fascinating legal puzzle. We spent a week strategizing, building a file that was less an emotional plea and more a meticulous, undeniable timeline of deceit. But we were missing the most critical piece of the puzzle: the star witness, Alara Vance. Finding her was easy. Getting her to talk to me was another matter entirely. The cottage was just as it appeared on the satellite map, a small weathered structure almost swallowed by the overgrown woods. The paint was peeling, and the garden was a tangle of weeds. It felt like a place where someone had given up. I knocked on the door, my heart a nervous drum against my ribs. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, held by a tarnished brass chain, and I, pale and wary, peered out at me. "My name is Iris Croft," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "My parents were Robert and Marion. They were part of the collective." The eye blinked. The door started to close. "Wait," I said, a little too loudly. "I'm not with them. I think your ex-husband stole from my family, and I think he stole from you first." The door stopped moving. There was a long, heavy silence, filled only by the sound of the wind in the pines. Then the chain rattled, and the door opened. The woman who stood before me was a ghost. Alara Vance was bird-boned and frail, with a cloud of white hair that seemed too heavy for her thin neck. Her face was a roadmap of sorrow, but her eyes, the same ones that had peered through the crack, were startlingly intelligent. She looked at me, a long, searching look, and then gestured for me to come inside. Her home was the antithesis of the collective next door, where their aesthetic was all bright, airy minimalism and manufactured serenity. Her cottage was cramped and dark, filled with the ghosts of a life interrupted. The air was thick with the scent of dust and dried herbs. Every surface was covered in books, stacks of them on history, botany, and art. She was a curator of a world that had ended in 1978. Over the next few days, I visited her again and again, bringing her groceries, a thermos of hot tea, and slowly, cautiously, earning a sliver of her trust. Her story came out in fragments, whispered between long silences. She and Elias, the man the world now knew as Eli, had been dreamers. They bought the land together in the early 70s, hippies with a vision of living off the grid, of creating something real and beautiful. He was always the charismatic one, the talker. She was the quiet one, the gardener, the one who understood the soul of the land. Then people started showing up, followers, drawn to Eli's easy charm and his burgeoning spiritual philosophy. At first, it was exciting, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It felt like we were building a community, but the community became a crowd, and the crowd became a congregation. And she looked down at her gnarled hands. I got lost in the noise. He told me I wasn't evolving. He said my energy was too grounded. He started an affair with a wealthy young follower, a girl whose father would become one of the collective's first major donors. He told Alara she had to leave. For the good of the community. He said he would take care of the paperwork, that he would make sure she got her half of the land's value when it was properly established. "Did you sign anything?" I asked, holding my breath. She shook her head. I packed a bag, and I left. I moved into this cottage, which was my parents' originally. I was heartbroken, ashamed. I just wanted to disappear. She had never seen the quit-claim deed. She never received $1. He had simply waited for her to be broken, then forged her name and erased her from the story. For 40 years, she had lived in the shadow of his success, listening to the faint sounds of their chanting and music, a prisoner of a memory, too frightened and ashamed to fight back. He had told her that if she ever made trouble, he would use his followers and his money to prove she was mentally unstable, and she believed him. This was the core of our case. She was the hidden leverage, the living proof of his original sin. My fight was no longer just my own. It was hers, too. I felt a fierce, protective surge for this fragile woman. It wasn't just about tearing Eli down anymore. It was about building Alara up. This subplot, her journey from a frightened recluse to a woman reclaiming her name, became as important to me as my own. The final piece of the plan was a subplot of my own creation, a bit of psychological warfare. I began investigating the collective's finances. As a non-profit, their financial disclosures were public record, if you knew where to look. I spent a week combing through years of tax filings. What I found was a pattern. The community was barely breaking even on its retreats and workshops. The real money, the lifeblood of the entire operation, came from a handful of extremely wealthy older patrons, the kind of people who were terrified of their own mortality and willing to write enormous checks for a guru who promised them a form of spiritual permanence. These were the people who sat on the board of directors. These were the people who would care very deeply if it turned out their entire spiritual investment was built on stolen land and common fraud. With Jenna's help, we drafted the letter. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was something far more insidious. A notice of competing claim to title and demand for rent. It was a masterpiece of legal threat, dense with citations of property law and precedents of fraudulent conveyance. It detailed, in painstaking verifiable detail, Eli's original purchase of the land, the joint tenancy with Alara, the suspicious quit-claim deed, and our expert's preliminary opinion that the signature was a forgery. It concluded by stating Alara Vance's claim as the rightful 50% owner of the property and demanded 40 years of back rent, calculated at market rates and adjusted for inflation, a sum so astronomical it would bankrupt them 10 times over. It was time to make the first move. We weren't going to storm the gates. We were going to poison the well. Jenna sent the notice via certified mail to every single member of the Equinox Collective's board of directors, at their private homes. We sent a copy to their primary financial institution, and of course a copy to Eli himself. Then we waited. The silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. For 3 days, nothing. I sat in my apartment, jumping at every email notification, every phone call. I started to doubt myself. Maybe he would just ignore it. Maybe his charisma was so powerful, he could make a legal document simply disappear. Then on the 4th day, the first crack appeared. It was a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man named Arthur Pennington, a name I recognized from the board of directors. His voice was tight with controlled panic. "Miss Croft, I am calling on behalf of the board of the Equinox Collective. We have received some troubling correspondence. We believe there has been a significant misunderstanding. Please call me at your earliest convenience to clarify this matter." Clarify. The word was a coward's shield. They weren't angry. They were nervous. They weren't threatening. They were scrambling. I played the message for Jenna. She laughed, a sharp, delighted sound. "They're spooked," she said. "The old money hates scandal. They don't care about enlightenment. They care about their reputations and their tax write-offs. We've bypassed the guru and gone straight to his financiers." The real show started that evening. My phone rang again. This time the caller ID was blocked. I had a feeling I knew who it was. I let it ring, and ring, and ring. Then the voicemail notification popped up. I pressed play, my hand trembling slightly. The voice that filled my apartment was as smooth as honey, as calm as a placid lake. It was Eli. "Iris. It's Eli. I was so saddened to hear about your parents. They were beautiful, radiant souls. I feel their energy with us still." He paused, letting the faux sincerity hang in the air. "I think there's been some confusion, a simple mistake made by lawyers and their paperwork. It's a worldly matter, and it's causing some unnecessary ripples in the harmony we've all built here. I'd love to talk to you, to clear the air. We're all family here, after all. Family." The word was a shard of glass in my ear. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it sent a hot flash of rage through me. He was trying to love-bomb me, to pull me into his sticky web of spiritual platitudes. I deleted the message. An hour later he called again. Another voicemail. This time, the honey had a touch of acid. "Iris, it's important we speak. These are serious, unfounded allegations. You are being manipulated by forces you don't understand. There are people who wish to harm the light we've created here. You are grieving, and your pain is being used. Do not let these dark energies corrupt your parents' beautiful legacy." Dark energies. That was me. I was the dark energy. I almost laughed. The mask was slipping. His panic was beginning to show. The third voicemail, which came near midnight, was stripped of all pretense. The voice was cold, hard, and menacing. "You have no idea what you are doing. You are playing with fire. The people who support our work are very powerful. This path you are on will only lead to your own destruction. Drop this. Drop this now, before you do irreparable damage to yourself." Destruction. Damage. The spiritual guru had been replaced by a common thug. This was the real Eli. The man who had cheated his wife, lied to his followers, and preyed on the emotional vulnerability of people like my parents. He wasn't a holy man. He was just a con artist. And his con was finally, after 40 years, starting to unravel. I saved that last voicemail. It was evidence. It was the sound of a guilty man panicking. And it was the sweetest music I had ever heard. The silent takeover was working. The foundations of his peaceful retreat were shaking, and I was the one causing the earthquake, without ever setting foot on his stolen land. The fallout was swifter than I could have imagined. My quiet, targeted attack had bypassed the disciples and hit the investors, and that made all the difference. Rumors, once they start in a closed community built on trust, spread like a virus. The board members, those wealthy patrons of enlightenment, started asking questions. They weren't asking Eli about the vibrational frequency of the cosmos anymore. They were asking him about fraudulent conveyance and quit-claim deeds. My friend Jenna had a source, a junior associate at the law firm that represented one of the board members, who fed us sanitized tidbits of the chaos. The board had convened an emergency meeting. Eli, apparently, had tried to handle it with his usual arsenal of charismatic deflection. He spoke of a karmic test of my negative psychic residue from a troubled relationship with my parents. He tried to frame me as a greedy, vengeful daughter, trying to smear her parents' beautiful final choice. But these were not his usual followers. These were hard-nosed business people, who, despite their New Age hobbies, understood risk. The phrase competing claim to title is a death knell for any property-based enterprise. It meant the land, the very ground their multi-million-dollar retreat was built on, was a toxic asset. It meant their donations, their legacy, could be tied up in court for years, or worse, be nullified entirely. The first major defection happened a week after we sent the letter. A woman named Beatrice Dane, a semi-retired actress with a massive social media following and a deep pocketbook, had been one of the collective's most visible proponents. She had been on talk shows, extolling the virtues of Eli's teachings. One morning, she posted a cryptic message on her Instagram. It was a picture of a single, unadorned white candle, with the caption, "Sometimes the light shows you things you didn't want to see." Taking some time for quiet reflection, away from all communities, #truth #journey. It was subtle, but in the world of the collective, it was a bombshell. Her followers went into a frenzy. What did it mean? Was she leaving? The collective's official social media was bombarded with questions. Their response was a blandly corporate statement about respecting Beatrice's privacy on her spiritual journey, but everyone knew what it meant. The first rat was off the ship. This started the exodus. It was a slow trickle at first, then a steady stream. Other prominent members began to quietly withdraw. A tech billionaire, who had funded the construction of their state-of-the-art meditation dome, put a stop payment on his latest seven-figure pledge. People who had paid up front for a year's worth of retreats began demanding refunds, citing a crisis of faith in the leadership. The family, the carefully curated family of believers Eli had spent decades building, was starting to dissolve. Eli's counter-manipulation was a sight to behold. He called a mandatory community-wide meeting in the main hall. Someone, a disillusioned member, who was already packing their bags, live-streamed it on a private link and sent it to me. I watched, mesmerized, from the safety of my apartment. Eli stood on the stage, dressed in his signature white linen, but he looked strained. The serene mask was still in place, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a frantic energy just beneath the surface. He spoke of a great trial, a test sent to weed out the weak of faith from the true believers. He didn't mention me by name, but he didn't have to. He called me the serpent in the garden, a lost soul lashing out from a place of deep spiritual poverty. He wove a masterful, manipulative tapestry of lies, painting himself as the victim, the noble shepherd protecting his flock from a vicious, worldly attack. He told them their faith was the only shield against the darkness. He told them to donate more, to show their commitment, to push back against the negativity with an overwhelming wave of positive financial energy. It was, in its own twisted way, a brilliant performance. He was trying to turn my legal attack into a holy war, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted in the one place it could not be uprooted, the balance sheet. His flock was shrinking, and his angels, his investors, were flying away. The pressure I was putting on him was immense, but I felt a different kind of pressure building on my own ally, Alara. With every small victory, she seemed to shrink further into herself. The prospect of a real confrontation, of actually facing the man who had erased her, terrified her. One afternoon, I went to her cottage and found her sitting in the dark, the curtains drawn. She said, "Maybe we should stop. I can't face him in court. He'll twist everything. He'll make me look like a fool." I sat with her in the dusty silence of her forgotten life. I told her, "He's already made you look like a fool for 40 years, Alara. He's counted on your silence. It's the only power he has left. We don't have to go to court if you don't want to. But you have to decide if you want to spend the rest of your life as a ghost, or if you want to live in your own home." It was a harsh thing to say, but it was the truth. It was the question I had essentially asked myself after the will was read. This was her inciting incident, her moment to choose. She didn't answer me then, but when I left, she was standing at the window, staring out at the land that should have been hers, a flicker of something new and hard in her pale eyes. The power was shifting, not just between me and Eli, but inside the one person whose story started it all. The final confrontation was inevitable. Eli was hemorrhaging money and followers. His board had given him an ultimatum: fix this or we will. His lawyers had probably told him his legal position was untenable. His last resort was his first, and most potent, weapon, his own charisma. He called Jenna, and demanded a face-to-face meeting. Not with lawyers, he insisted, just with me. He wanted to heal the rift personally. Jenna was against it. "It's a trap," she said. "He's going to try to manipulate you." "I know," I replied, "but he needs to see me. He needs to see that I'm not some abstract, dark energy. I'm a person, and I'm not coming alone." I went to Alara's cottage. She was in the garden, pulling weeds with a vigor I hadn't seen before. I told her about the meeting. I told her I needed her there. Not to speak, not to testify, just to be present. "I need him to see you," I said. She looked up at me, her hands covered in rich, dark earth. Her eyes were clear. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "It's time." We met on neutral ground, in a sterile conference room at a hotel, halfway between the city and the retreat. Eli was already there when we arrived. He stood as I walked in, his face arranged in a mask of deep, compassionate sorrow. He looked older, tired. The guru costume was starting to fray at the edges. His eyes fell on me, and he began his practice speech. "Iris, thank you for coming. My heart aches for the pain you must be in." He stopped. His gaze had shifted to the woman who had entered behind me. His jaw went slack. The serene mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He stared at Alara, as if he had seen a ghost, and in a way he had. He hadn't seen her face in 4 decades. He saw a frail old woman, yes, but he also saw the wife he had betrayed, the crime he had buried, the one person on earth who knew the real truth behind the myth of Eli. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice cracking. She said nothing. She just stood there, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She just looked present. She was no longer a ghost. She was a fact. And her presence in that room annihilated his entire narrative. He stumbled backward, sinking into a chair. The power dynamic in the room tilted, suddenly and irrevocably. He was no longer the enlightened master. He was just a man, a guilty man, caught in the headlights of his own past. I sat down opposite him. I didn't need to say a word. The silence in the room was deafening. He tried to recover, turning his attention back to me, but the spell was broken. His words, when they came, were hollow. "We can fix this, Iris. The collective wants to honor your parents' wishes. We can make a donation in their name to a charity of your choice. A sizable one. We can make this right." "It wasn't about the money," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. "It was never about my parents' money. It was about his. It was about this." I slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a clean, new copy of the quitclaim deed. His eyes darted to the forged signature of Alara Vance. "This is what this is about, Eli. This is the foundation of your entire life, and it's made of sand." He stared at the paper, then at Alara, then at me. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The guru was speechless. He had built an empire on words, and in the end a single silent woman and a piece of paper had taken them all away. The new reality settled in quickly. Faced with undeniable evidence of fraud and the public testimony of Alara, Eli and the board had no choice but to surrender. There was no dramatic courtroom battle. It was all handled in a series of quiet, devastatingly effective legal maneuvers by Jenna. The Equinox Collective was dissolved. The board members, desperate to avoid a public scandal and potential lawsuits from duped followers, agreed to a settlement. The land, all 100 acres of it, was transferred back into Alara Vance's name. A significant portion of the collective's remaining liquid assets, the money my parents and so many others had donated, was placed in a trust for her, a fund to cover the decades of lost income and to pay for the restoration of the property. Eli was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the looming threat of criminal fraud charges, which the district attorney was now pursuing with great interest. He had vanished, reportedly last seen boarding a plane to a country with no extradition treaty. As for my parents' inheritance, the money from my grandfather's portfolio, it was gone, absorbed into the settlement and legal fees. And I found, to my surprise, that I truly did not care. I had won something far more valuable. I had corrected the historical record. I had exposed a lie and returned something to its rightful owner. My actions hadn't brought my parents back, and it hadn't healed the old wounds of my childhood, but it had dismantled the monument to their delusion. It had brought a quiet, clean, and satisfying end to their chaotic story. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. That's a phrase I've thought about a lot, and I've come to realize that maybe my initial motivation wasn't revenge in the hot-blooded sense. It was about order. It was about truth. My whole life is about verifying that things are what they claim to be. A manuscript, a deed, a life. Eli's entire existence was a forgery, and I, in my own quiet, meticulous way, had simply authenticated it as such. The satisfaction, the quiet schadenfreude of watching his empire crumble under the weight of its own lies, was just a bonus. A deeply, deeply satisfying bonus. The moral of this story, if there is one, is not simple. It's not just that cheaters never prosper, or that the truth will always out. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the lies win. My victory wasn't guaranteed by some cosmic law of justice. It was earned. It was earned through sleepless nights, through dusty archives, through the careful application of a specific skill set. It was earned by finding an ally and helping her find the strength to stand up. Justice isn't a passive force. It's an active one. It's a choice. A few months ago, I drove up to visit Alara. The grand, imposing sign for the Equinox Collective was gone, replaced by a simple wooden sign that read Vance Woods. The yurts were gone. The meditation dome was being dismantled. Alara was out in the field where the main hall used to be, directing a crew that was planting native wildflowers. She looked younger, stronger. The ghost was gone, replaced by a woman of substance, a woman standing on her own land. She was creating something real, something that didn't require belief or donations, something that would simply grow. She handed me a spade. "We have a lot of work to do," she said, a real, genuine smile reaching her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was home. My parents chased enlightenment their whole lives, looking for it in all the wrong people and all the wrong places. They thought it was a destination you could buy your way into. But maybe, just maybe, it's not about finding the light. Maybe it's about having the courage to face the darkness, to call out the lies, and to plant a garden in the ruins. So, here's my question to you. Have you ever felt like you were the only one who saw the truth? The only one who knew the story everyone else was telling was a complete and utter fiction? It's a lonely place to be, but sometimes, being the keeper of the real story is the most powerful position you can be in. You just have to be patient enough and brave enough to find the right moment to turn the page. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever dealt with a situation that felt hopeless, or a person who seemed untouchable, I hope this gives you a little bit of strength. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to fight to set the record straight in your own life. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories about getting the justice you deserve. It really does help. Thank you again for being here with me today.